So I'm going to just continue where I believe I left off. I'm not even sure. The race catechism Garveyites used explained the significance of the red, black, and green. As for the red, the color of the blood which men must shed for their redemption and liberty, black for the color of the noble and distinguished race to which we belong, and green for the luxuriant vegetation of our motherland. On at least one occasion, Garvey gave a different explanation for the colors. Here his purpose seems to have been to deliberately alarm his interviewer, Charles Mowbray White, a member of the conservative coalition of businessmen, moderate trade unionists, and professional people known as the National Civic Federation. He told White that the red expressed the UNIA sympathy with the Reds of the world. The green expressed a similar sympathy for the Irish in their struggle against the British, and the black stood for people of the African race. The nationalist implications of Garvey's flag, like other aspects of Garvey's thought, were not confined to Afro-America, but inspired nationalist struggles on the African continent too. Thus, at the charter unveiling ceremony of the UNIA Woodstock Division in Cape Town, South Africa in 1924, the featured speaker, J.G. Gums, expressed particular gratitude for the red, black, and green flag, a flag as he expressed it of our own. In the next year, the African National Congress, also of South Africa, adopted a gold, black, and green flag. Gold for the country's wealth, black for the people, and green for the land. The flag was suggested by a Garvey admirer and influential ANC member, T.D. Mweli Skota. I believe that's how you pronounce it. In the 1950s, the red, black, and green could be seen in Kenya, this time with the shield, arrow, and spear superimposed on it as the flag of Jomo Kenyatta's nationalist Kenyatta African Union. One of the more important consequences of Garvey's doctrine of nationhood was the establishment of representatives of the race in strategic areas. To this end, the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World had called upon the various governments of the world to accept and acknowledge Negro representatives who shall be sent to said governments to represent the general welfare of the Negro peoples of the world. Just days after the adoption of his declaration, the announcement was made that the UNIA's leader of the American Negroes would take up residence in a black house in Washington, since black people could not elect one of their own to the White House. But even before the declaration and the Black House proposal, which was not implemented, the UNIA had sent commissioners to France to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Their lobbying efforts did not succeed in obtaining any abatement in the zeal of the European imperialist powers to seize the ex-German African colonies. Perhaps for this reason, the 1920 Declaration wrote the League of Nations off as null and void as far as the Negro is concerned, in that it seeks to deprive Negroes of their liberty. Nevertheless, by 1922, the UNIA was ready to try the League again, a delegation consisting of Oxford-trained George O. Mark from Sierra Leone, Professor J.J. Adam from Haiti, who was educated at Tuskegee, William Levon Sherrill from Afro-America, a graduate of Philander Smith College, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Professor James O'Meally from Jamaica, a former teacher at Calabar College, proceeded to Geneva to lay a petition before the League. The petition requested that the ex-German colonies be turned over to black leadership, since black soldiers have been responsible for their capture. The petition suggested that under the black leadership, they could make good within 20 years. Then 400 million black people would not be serfs any longer. The delegation arrived in Geneva early in September 1922, secured seats in the Assembly Hall, was admitted to all committee rooms, and met with the director of the Mandate section of the League, whom they urged to appoint a black person to the Permanent Mandates Commission. After lobbying for 3.5 weeks, they were able to interest the Persian delegation in submitting the petition on behalf of the UNIA. The Persians did so, but by this time the current session of the League was in 3 days of ending, and the petition was therefore filed away for consideration at the 1923 session. The UNIA delegation succeeded in being seated among the official delegates rather than in the gallery where non-official delegates sat. According to a member of the delegation, of about 300 similar unofficial delegates attempting to present petitions, only the UNIA representatives succeeded. For the 1923 League session, the UNIA again dispatched a representative in the hope that the 1922 petition would be debated. This time, the sole delegate was Professor Jean Joseph Adam, a former president of the San Francisco UNIA division and secretary and translator to the 1922 delegation. Now, he was upgraded to the rank of first provisional ambassador of the Negro peoples of the world to France. He would reside in Paris and would lobby at Geneva. He sailed from New York on August 23rd, and on August 24th, the British Consul General in New York City, who kept a close watch on the UNIA, so informed the British ambassador in Washington, the British ambassador in Washington, who so informed the Foreign Office in London. By the time that Adam got to Europe, the League, probably at the instigation of Britain and France, whose ex-German African territories were the objects of the UNIA's race-conscious desires, had quietly thwarted Garvey's plans. They had gotten around the UNIA's assumption of nationality by resolving that all nationals with grievances should present them through their respective governments. As far as Garvey was concerned, of course, the African, wherever he lived, pardon me, I think that's making too much noise, right? So let me cut that off for a moment. Yeah, I got around the assumption, blah, 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 blah. The African, where he lived, had no government to speak of, had no government to speak to his interests, and so he should be heard as a race. And the UNIA, with its aspirations to nationhood, represented these racial interests. The petition could hardly have pleased European governments, calling as it did for racial political liberty and recalling the heroic efforts of black soldiers, supposedly in the cause of democracy. It showed that all subject peoples had received something out of the war except the majority of Africans. We readily appreciate the fact that the League of Nations has taken in consideration the restoration of the Palestine to the Jew. Ireland has been given the consideration of a free state government. Egypt has been granted a form of independence, and there is still a great consideration for India, who was represented at the peace conference at Versailles through and by reason of the splendid service rendered by the Indian soldiers. Garvey issued a renewed petition in 1928 and continued to try to attract the League's attention thereafter, but he never came any closer to success than in 1922. The UNIA drive for nationhood did not stop with commissioners to the League of Nations and a provisional ambassador to France. Traveling commissioners were constantly on the move, establishing personal contact with UNIA branches. There were also provisional ambassadors appointed in the legislation set up in other places besides France. One such place was Liberia, where a legation was set up in 1921. The resident secretary summed up his duties in a letter to Garvey in the following terms: the oral instructions of Your Excellency being conceived from the point of view that the post was a diplomatic one. The commissariat, a legation, and my position secretary to the legation indicated that I should do all the legation secretary would be expected to do: study the Liberian situation, the people in the government, ferret out all important news about whomsoever and whatsoever, and make confidential reports to Your Excellency direct, aside from other reports that I might send to the council through Your Excellency. In the case of Liberia, Garvey had attempted to establish a legation without openly advertising it as such. In January 1924, however, he dispatched an ambassador to Britain in much fanfare. He had been distressed during his travels in Europe to discover that all peoples and races residing there had someone who could look after their interests except the black man. The first UNIA ambassador to Britain was Sir Richard Hilton Talbot. Talbot, a former African Methodist Episcopal minister and schoolmaster in Bermuda, had attended the 1920 UNIA convention and was one of the signers of the Declaration of Rights. He was elected leader of the eastern provinces of the West Indies, and as a result of his refusal to disavow the UNIA, he lost his position in the church and suffered a withdrawal of government support from his school. On his appointment, when he was admitted by Garvey to the exclusive order of Knight Commander of the Sublime Order of the Nile, which entitled him to use the prefix Sir, he was charged with the task of representing the interests of the Negro peoples of the world at the court of St. James. He was to study the political situation in England as it affected the African race. Garvey considered the time propitious because 1924 was a year of Labor Party rule. A Labor government, Garvey surmised, would be less difficult to deal with than aristocratic conservatives, since they should have some sympathy for the aspirations of the mass of people. For this reason, too, Talbot was charged with creating favorable sentiment among the English working class. For as Garvey explained, if you can convince the English working man that he has no cause for complaint against the Negro, it would be impossible for any government in Great Britain to do anything that would affect the interests of the Negroes. If English workers refused to fight, then there was no way that Britain could go to war with the UNIA in Africa. Talbot, like Adam in France, would be a provisional ambassador only and would give way when a truly independent Africa began sending ambassadors of its own. Garvey, with all the aplomb of a master propagandist, officially informed the British government of the appointment of the Honorable Richard Hilton Talbot as High Commissioner and Minister Plenipotentiary to His Britannic Majesty's government in a note that read, Honorable Richard Hilton Talbot is accredited by the Universal Negro Improvement Association to interest himself in all matters affecting the interests of the Negro race within Great Britain. It continued, pardon me. His credentials have been submitted to His Majesty's Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, and it is hoped that His Majesty's government will accord to him such courtesies as are extended to other representatives of independent races and sovereign peoples. Upon arrival in England, Talbot requested interviews with the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State of the Colonial Office so that he might present the credentials of the UNIA and ACL. His request precipitated a debate over whether a response should properly come from the British Foreign Office or the Colonial Office. One Colonial Office official suggested that it was the business of his department to keep Garvey and his associates out of West Africa, not out of Number 10, keeping the UNIA out of Number 10, the official residence of the British Prime Minister, should be the responsibility of the Foreign Office. Another Colonial Office official considered the adverse effects on British colonialism in the West Indies, which would flow from any such official recognition of the UNIA, that the confidence of the West Indies in HMG, His Majesty's government, would suffer a rude shock if any sort of official recognition were given to this association, which has a record of fraud, sedition, and incitement to violence. Not surprisingly, Talbot's request for an interview to present his credentials was finally turned down. The High Commissioner nevertheless did remain in England a while, addressing meetings of UNIA branches in Manchester and London. In 1925, as High Commissioner of the Eastern Provinces of the West Indies, he fared much better with the Dutch colony of Suriname, where he was received by the governor and given the freedom of the colony. 1 year before refusing to accept Garvey's High Commissioners to the Court of St. James, the British government had seriously considered extending quasi-diplomatic recognition to the Cuban UNIA division. The situation in Cuba was unique. Here, thousands of black workers, especially Haitians and Jamaicans, have for years been recruited to work as laborers on Cuban sugar plantations. In Cuba, these black workers were ruthlessly oppressed and were afforded practically no legal protection, either by the Cuban government or by British diplomatic personnel. In this situation, the UNIA became firmly entrenched among the black workers in Cuba, and in time became Mutual Aid Society, Race Uplift Organization, and quasi-government for the black population. It was practically the only effective attempt to look after the interests. Not surprisingly, by the mid-1920s, Cuba had the largest number of UNIA divisions and chapters of any country except the United States. In this situation, the British minister in Cuba bought the UNIA's idea of extending semi-official recognition to it as the organization protecting the interests of British West Indian workers in Cuba. The Foreign Office in London, to whom the suggestion was forwarded, decided to sound out three governors of its West Indian colonies before coming to a decision. These governors, all of them well acquainted with the work of the UNIA in their own colonies, were mostly hostile to the idea. The governor of Barbados explained that there were but 2 UNIA branches in the island, one of which was composed of more solid men and lacked any distinctly anti-white proclivities, while the other was allegedly very probably disloyal. Semi-official recognition of the Cuban UNIA would give a fillip to the local branches, which might end headaches for British colonialism. If, however, he replied to the Foreign Office query, the Cuban branch were recognized as the center of protection of the interests of the British West Indians in that country, I perceive that the society would obtain a status in this colony that might be very inconvenient. It would certainly result in a very large increase in membership, and the hotheads in association would probably be awakened to renewed zeal to stir up trouble between the two races. The Barbadians are generally a quiet, well-behaved body of men, but they are very excitable and easily roused. He further indicated that UNIA members had recently sent threatening letters to planters and were encouraging the workers to strike, and with the approach of crop time and sugar plantations, these hotheads might become restive. Furthermore, it would be inconsistent to recognize the UNIA in Cuba and press it in Barbados. The British governor of Jamaica was somewhat less hostile to the idea, possibly because the Cuban UNIA was largely Jamaican in composition. He was inclined to be against recognition, but in the peculiar circumstances, as a means of obtaining concerted action for the protection of British West Indians in that country, he could not foresee how this government would be embarrassed by semi-official recognition of the person's mission, provided that care is taken to prevent all idea that this government is in any way party to the recognition. The governor of Trinidad, where the UNIA was usually most repressed among the British West Indian Islands, replied briefly with venom. I am strongly averse to any action which might in any way lead to the Universal Negro Improvement Association believing that His Majesty's government regarded the association as one which could in any way improve the position of His Majesty's Negro population in the West Indies. He added that he had recently refused a petition from the Trinidad UNIA to lift a ban on the Negro rule, owing to the objectionable character of the matter which this publication continues to contain. Based on these opinions, the British minister in Cuba was advised to withhold recognition. Thereafter, the Cuban government, with collusion of such American employers of black labor as the United Fruit Company, increased its campaign against the UNIA, which, among other things, was responsible for strikes against 3 employers. UNIA officials were sometimes jailed and branches were sometimes closed by the government. In 1930, Garvey himself was refused permission to visit Cuba. General Manuel Delgado, Secretary of the Interior, explained that there was no race problem in Cuba, but the UNIA was nevertheless stirring up the same. He also issued a statement ordering the provincial governments to close all UNIA branches. If Garvey's provisional government was well supplied with ambassadors and traveling commissioners, he himself on his travels acted like a head of state, requesting and sometimes receiving interviews with such dignitaries as the governors of British Honduras and the president of Costa Rica. The UNIA's assumption of nationality was not without its humorous incidents. In 1923, the organization dispatched an official delegation to the funeral of President Warren Harding. The delegation rode in a car complete with a member complete with a member of the Universal African Legions on each running board. After the funeral, the delegation amused themselves by driving through the streets of Washington and watching the policemen salute and hold up the traffic to let them pass. They had obviously been mistaken for representatives of a southern state. William Sherrill, remembering the incident a decade later, explained that, having never before enjoyed such consideration at the behest of Southern police, we took full advantage of our mistaken identity. Underpinning Garvey's predilection toward nationhood were his own speculations on political theory. He conceived the major problem of democratic practice to be the devising of a mechanism of government which would ensure the permanent representation of the popular will, a popular will that would be synonymous with the expression of the majority of the population, but which would somehow ensure that all citizens of that government will be satisfied in sympathy with each other. He found fault with American democracy on this score. He explained that often only a minority of the population actually votes for the President of the United States, so he does not necessarily represent the will of the majority. Furthermore, since the executive often controlled the judiciary, appealing from one to the other would sometimes be like appealing from Caesar to Caesar. Garvey once wrote a short essay, Governing the Ideal State, on these problems of non-majority government and insensitivity to the popular will. He proceeded on the premise that since all systems of government ultimately depend on human implementation, he would devise a system whereby representatives of the people will fulfill their trust or suffer immediate recall, disgrace, and execution. Government should be absolute, and the head should be thoroughly responsible for himself and the acts of his subordinates. He should be the sole honor, and when he is legally or properly found to the contrary, he should be publicly disgraced and put to death as an outcast and an unworthy representative of the righteous will of the people. The threat of instant recall and death should also hang over the heads of the ruler's subordinate officials. To further ensure the incorruptibility of the ruler, Garvey suggested that he be removed from all pecuniary obligations and desires of material nature. though the device of a very large salary and allowances, both during and after his administration. In return, the ruler should devote himself entirely to the governance of the state, and during the period of his administration, he should forestall the possibility of sectarian interest group pressure by spurning the company of all friends outside of his immediate family. Rulers found to have abused their trust would be executed, and images of them should be made and placed in the National Hall of Criminology and Ill Fame, and their crimes should be recited and the curse pronounced upon them and their generations. Furthermore, Garvey foreshadowed the unwillingness of a latter generation of black activists to be restricted by established political ideologies by insisting that he felt free to pick out the best in every government, whether that government be monarchical, democratic, or Soviet. Garvey's thoughts on democracy led him inevitably to the consideration of capitalism and communism. Since the concept of democracy is meaningless without relation to the economic system underpinning it, he considered a capitalism to be a necessary stage in human advancement while simultaneously expressing uneasiness at the results of its unrestrained uses. Garvey's disapproval for unrestrained capitalism extended to the nascent upper crust of his own race. Like Frantz Fanon, 3 decades later, he thought that this class among the black race was more destructive than similarly circumstanced persons among the white and other races. For while white millionaires endowed charitable foundations and otherwise displayed some progressive characteristics, rich black persons tended to be more parasitical and destructive to their own race. Garvey in 1924 expressed this idea thus: we have not only to fight the white capitalist, but we also have to fight the capitalistic Negro. He will sell his own people when they're held the same as anybody else. In 1929, he repeated similar sentiments. The Negro colored race is developing a class of millionaires or money hoarders much more dangerous to the race's life and existence than any similar group of men among any other race. For solutions to these problems, Garvey leaned toward reforms of a social democratic nature rather than toward the complete irrational system. He favored ceilings of 5 million funds. Sums accumulated above these figures should be appropriated by the state. The state should. Yeah, that was so rude. Hopefully we can continue. I don't even know where I was at, y'all. Appropriate. Okay. The state should also expropriate without compensation the assets of capitalists and corporations who fomented wars and strife in the furtherance of their financial interests. In his own organizations, Garvey attempted to implement these ideas by organizing his business ventures along cooperative lines and by placing a ceiling on the number of shares any one person could own. He seems to have sometimes seen efforts such as these as attempts by poor people to establish a capitalistic system of their own to combat the heartless capitalistic system of the masterly ruling class. On one occasion, while representing workers in Jamaica in a dispute with the United Fruit Company, he even described himself as a capitalist in an attempt to show that he also was an employer of labor, but nevertheless found ways to avoid the excesses concerning which the strikers he represented were complaining. Garvey's ideas on capitalism and communism can be illustrated also by the company he kept, so to speak. For the third world leaders he admired were generally those with a similar political outlook, people like himself, involved in nationalist struggles and attempting to walk a precarious tightrope between capitalism and communism. The most important of these were Mahatma Gandhi in India, Clement Attlee being a member of this party. His belief that the Labor Party would show greater sensitivity to the aspirations of black people was a perennial dream of colonized peoples in the British Empire, but one that was usually betrayed. In 1923, for example, Garvey, rejoicing over the fact that the British Labour Party was now the official opposition in Parliament, editorialized on the significance of this event for black British subjects. Let us take new courage as well as firm confidence in our effort, and let us be inspired through the achievement of Labour Party in England and the labor forces all over the world. The ascendancy of labor in politics will bring about a new political order which cannot be be as senseless as the one to which they succeed. Labor may have enough sense to know that the best course it could adapt toward its own prosperity is to be fair and friendly to all human groups. We would not contemplate labor going out to fight other peoples for the adventurous exploitation of that which is naive to such peoples. We cannot think of Ramsay MacDonald as Premier of England declaring war against native Africans who seek to protect their native rights, but would expect it of David Lloyd George or an Arthur J. Balfour, who represent the Tory element and the capitalistic crowds of their country. We are glad of the downfall, therefore, of the Tory government of England. We also rejoice when other monopolist political organizations tumble down to be succeeded by the control of that element of the people who know what human love is, who know what justice is. In 1924, Garvey celebrated the victory of MacDonald's short-lived government with a telegram informing the new prime minister that the UNIA looked to labor as allies of the black race in the fight for national independence in Africa. Almost simultaneously, he dispatched his UNIA ambassador to England. The propitiousness of the time and Garvey's generally favorable attitude toward the Labour Party may have had something to do with the fact that at about this very time, the London UNIA was expressing appreciation to the Labour Party for assisting unemployed black persons in London to find work. This unusual endorsement of labor in Britain was partly due to Garvey's lack of substantial distinction between the Labour Party's welfare socialism on the one hand, and Russian socialism as practiced under Lenin on the other. For as will be seen later, despite his feuds with white communists in the United States, Garvey admired Lenin for his mass movement and his attempts to curtail capitalistic control, and he considered the British Labour Party to be of the same stripe. In eulogizing Lenin at Liberty Hall in 1924 upon the Russian leader's death, he said, "I believe in time that the whole world will take on a social democratic system of government now existing in Russia. It is only a question of time, I say. England is the first to have reached out for this perfect state of social democratic control among its peoples. By 1932, he was willing to admit that the Labour Party had not arrived at communism, but that it was working diligently towards this goal and would soon be red communist, a proposition that did not appear to alarm him. In the meantime, he had reiterated his support for the party during the 1929 elections. In 1927, the Labour Party did receive an opportunity to reciprocate in a minor fashion. South African trade union leader Clement Attlee, during a visit to Britain, succeeded in obtaining the party's assistance in the case of Nyasaland Asa MacDonald Lawrence, who had been sentenced by British authorities to 3 years at hard labor for importing into Central Africa 6 copies of Garvey's Negro World, and 2 of the South African Workers' Herald. A Labour MP, Richard Wallhead, raised the question in the House of Commons, and Lawrence was released shortly after. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because I think my phone about to die. And we will pick this up in just a little while. Peace.